This year, Australians will make one of the most important political decisions of their lifetime. They'll be voting to either change or preserve our nation's rulebook, that is, the Constitution, by enshrining a new institution, the Voice, which would make special representations to the Parliament and to the Executive on an extraordinary range, if not all, policy matters that might come before the government. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has called this a modest and gracious change.
A generous, modest and gracious offer.
Unfortunately, far from being modest, as has been observed and clearly pointed out by many senior journalists, constitutional experts and lawyers, it may be the most radical and unpredictable constitutional alteration in our history, and yet the Prime Minister and his team have not been able to clearly define the exact nature of this beast or why it would make a difference. Proponents of the Voice to Parliament argue it would be a first step towards national unity, truth-telling and closing the gap, or in other language, a treaty, reparations and truth-telling. And all that entails, it should be remembered that the Prime Minister has committed to the Uluru Statement in full, and it makes it plain that the Voice is, as one activist has put it, simply the hook upon which these later measures are to be hung. In reality, the Voice would permanently institutionalise racial politics. It would perpetuate unjustified intergenerational guilt, and it would divide Australians according to their race. An overwhelming number of Australians, myself included, my family have been involved and intertwined with Aboriginal communities now since the 1820s. I went to school with Aboriginal people. I represented a large number of Aboriginal people. We want to see the gap of disadvantage between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians closed. We also want to see Aboriginal Australians recognised, most appropriately, I think, in a preamble to the Constitution. But a constitutionally enshrined voice would only exacerbate division rather than solve disadvantage. And it does strike me indeed that if the objective is to close the gap and to end disadvantage, why would you lock it into the Constitution in perpetuity? That is to imply that its work will never be finished and will always be looking for areas of disagreement. Here are 4 myths that are used to justify support for the Voice. First, the idea that Aboriginal people are not fairly represented in our Parliament. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 3.2% of the national population, yet they make up 4.8% of federal politicians. That means there are actually more Indigenous parliamentarians than other Australians when considered in proportion to the population on the whole. Indigenous politicians often reflect, too, the diverse range of views of Indigenous Australians as a whole, from Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe to National Senator Jacinta Price. And this is a very important point, of course. Indigenous Australians, like everyone else, have a wide range of interests, of perspectives and of views on the best national policy prescriptions. The truth is, our Parliament represents Aboriginal people surprisingly well. We should celebrate this achievement rather than seek to ignore it and brush it aside and say we need a better way of going around it. Secondly, the idea that there is not enough institutional help for Indigenous Australians is a myth that I think needs exposing. The National Indigenous Australian Association directly funds over 1,100 organisations that work to improve the lives of First Nations people. And perhaps it might be wise to have a look at why it has failed in some areas before we consider yet another body. That body is also responsible for $4 billion of annual funding that goes specifically to Aboriginal organisations. There are over 50 peak councils in Australia that represent thousands of Aboriginal bodies, and within the Commonwealth Government there is a dedicated Indigenous Affairs Minister, and there are equivalent ministers and departments in our state and territory governments. I believe there are more than enough structures assisting Indigenous Australians in need. The issue is, what are they doing with all of these resources, willingly granted, I think, by the Australian people because they do care? We want them to do better, but we don't need a new additional layer of bureaucracy locked into the Constitution in perpetuity. Third is the myth that Aboriginal people haven't benefited from participating in modern Australia. The explanatory memorandum for The Voice argues that Indigenous disadvantage is caused by the ongoing effects of European settlement. Now, it is true that Aboriginal Australians suffered serious and traumatic consequences because of settlement, but it's not the full historical picture. Australian history also shows that many Indigenous Australians have loved and benefited from the fruits of European settlement. Of course, a great many Indigenous Australians continue to do so today. It's a far more complex picture than the simplistic view that's being pushed out there by activists. Australian anthropologist William Stanner wrote, "For every Aboriginal who had Europeans thrust upon him, at least one other had sought them out. More would have gone to European centres sooner if it had not been that their way was often barred by hostile Aboriginals." The Voice puts the blame for Aboriginal disadvantage on Australian society. This is a myth. Aboriginal disadvantages are caused by many factors, not just one. Renowned academic Peter Sutton has made the unpopular point that the most disadvantaged Aboriginal communities are the least colonised. The benefits, because there are benefits, that Western culture, science, technology brought to all Australians should not be underestimated. And the truth is that many Indigenous communities struggle with entrenched social issues that negatively impact a wide range of Australians. A wide range. Fatherlessness, family breakdown, issues I'm passionate about, and they are massive problems faced by many Indigenous children. Some Indigenous communities also remain distant, it has to be said, from essential services like schools, hospitals, and jobs, and the question must be asked, what's happened to the resources that have been made available and not properly audited in what we're told are programs that should have addressed these problems? It is simplistic and misleading to attribute all disadvantage to colonisation when there are these and other deep challenges that have multiple causes and, sadly, affect a wide range of Australians. By placing the blame on history, supporters of The Voice present an incomplete view of that history and distract from the tragic reality of generational welfare dependency, fatherlessness, social breakdown, and other factors contributing to the plight of disadvantaged. Fourth, there is a grand hope that The Voice would unify the country, but the evidence tells a different story, and this is very important. Despite decades of Indigenous land rights, a national apology, the widespread involvement of Indigenous ceremonies in our national events, and tens of billions of dollars spent every year to close the gap, we haven't closed it. Like all race politics, The Voice pits group against group. It would simplistically hold current Australians to account for past wrongs. It would create a mentality of victims and villains, us and them. And it would subvert our democratic process by dividing citizens on the basis of race and creating a special group right in the national rulebook. As the Aboriginal academic Anthony Dillon has written, not only is separatism founded on the mistruth that Aboriginal people are fundamentally different from non-Aboriginal people, but the separatist paradigm runs a risk of generating differences that don't exist. Ultimately, The Voice to Parliament, I believe, would create more division, more resentment than unity, and particularly in the sorts of communities that I interacted with on a very frequent basis when I was a federal member, where there is a real sense that Many of the programs that have been put in place have actually encouraged division, fed disunity, not improved them, and that's borne out now by the research. The trend line has been bad. I think this will be a continuation on of that bad trend line. I think it would be damaging for Australia, and so for these and other reasons, I do urge Australians to vote no in the upcoming referendum. We need to find, and we can find, a better way.